Dear all, thank you for listening. This presentation will begin slightly abruptly with a trailer from a Romanian documentary called Waves. It will end in the same manner with a second trailer from the above-mentioned documentary. This is a draft paper that deals with the impact of radio broadcasting on Romania during communist times. The above sentence may sound incomplete or at least imprecise. It should have included the term Western before radio broadcast, yet Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, the main institutions that my paper refers to, were outside the Romanian system only through their location. Their content was very much a part of the country's daily life. Secondly, my paper also provides a short history of the Romanian Radio Broadcasting Corporation to further explain the role that sounds, be it foreign or national, had in stirring up change. The events that took place in Brașov on November 15, 1987, which this paper looks at, were considered the prelude to the Romanian Revolution of 1989. Had it not been for the sounds and their echoes, since Romanians had after all broadcasted their revolution on TV, some might even say we would not have had a successful revolution at all. The first experimental transmission in Romania was broadcast in the summer of 1927. In March 1925. In March that year, Professor Dragomir Hurmuzescu had founded the Association of Radiophony Friends. Period broadcasts were made during 1926 and 1927 by the Friends of Radio Association and the University Electrotechnical Institute. The first broadcast in Craiova took place in September 1926, and it lasted for half an hour. The content was folk music, mostly a mini concert interpreted live with folk instruments, flute, leaf, violins. The radio station had a power of 100 watts and was received on a 100-kilometer range distance. In October 1926, in a correspondence with Romanians in Timok Valley, reception of the radio is confirmed beyond the Danube. In 1927, a shortwave emitter was installed and the first transatlantic experimental broadcasts were made. The gramophone recording broadcasts through electromagnetic cartridge had been clearly heard in Boston, the United States. All these events make so that in March 1928, the Romanian Radio Broadcasting Company was legally founded. The first official show was inaugurated by Professor Hurmuzescu, who became the president of the Administration Council of the Radio Telephonic Broadcasting Company. The number of broadcasting hours increased consistently, reaching 3,500 in 1934. However, at this time, most of the radio shows are music shows. 70% of the content, in fact, in 1929 and 52% in 1938 consists of radio shows. The political events after the end of World War II affected the institution, and the Romanian Radio Broadcasting Corporation became fully state-controlled in 1948. Naturally, a composer became its director. His name was Matei Socor. The number of broadcasting hours and territorial coverage increased during the communist regime. Moreover, regional stations emerged and radio receivers became ever more accessible. In 1952, a new radio headquarters was inaugurated in Bucharest, and on December 31st, 1956, the public television began broadcasting. Initially with a small numbers of subscribers, 500,000, but they reached 1.5 million in 1970. From the beginning, the Romanian television was envisioned by the Communist Party as an institution in the service of the government's ideology. Since its founding in 1956, it was placed under the supervision of the Radio and Television Committee, which reported to the Council of Ministers. This political body was meant to ensure the ideological and political role of the broadcast institution in society. In 1970, the television service received a new headquarters building, and its coverage increased to over 80% of the territory. From 1983, color television was introduced, but in 1985, much to the discontent of the population, the daily program was reduced to only 2 hours, and broadcasts by the second national channel, which had also hosted regional stations, were stopped. The television set and its visual content stepped in to replace radio transmitters. Just a few years earlier, in 1951, television was founded in 1956, official documents showed that the primary goals of the Romania's Communist Party were to educate and promote literacy amongst the masses, to elevate their cultural level, and to disseminate Soviet methods among the working peasantry, as well as to intensify persuasion work regarding collective farms among the peasantry as well. One of the means to achieve this was the radio, and listening to particular broadcasts on festive days or shows dealing with a specific content became an obligation. Unlike the TV shows of the 80s, radio content, however, was slightly more varied, mostly because of the number of the hours. Music, drama plays, and sport transmissions were also included, and amongst the few things still enjoyed by an otherwise starved and strictly controlled population. But Romanian radio waves did not provide much information about the outside world, nor did it present a true picture of the local society. Moreover, as circulation of both people and information was severely restricted, not much came out of Romania, or so popular wisdom would have us believe. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were established in 1949 and 1953 respectively, and aimed to keep alive the hope for freedom, serving as surrogate radios for the citizens within Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, whose own media was heavily censored. The broadcasters identified fully with the interests, culture, and the history of the represented country. Speaking in the first person plural, they articulated the kind of opinions that free media would have done had it existed. These were in fact home services speaking from abroad. How much influence did Radio Free Europe and Voice of America really had on current and mostly future developments in countries such as Romania is something of a trick question. If the house across the street is ablaze and Radio Free Europe doesn't confirm it, then it surely must be a hoax. Such was a common anecdote circulated in Romania during the Cold War years, according to Nestor Rates, former director of Radio Free Europe Romanian service. However, we lack in that public opinion polls for the bloc country citizens over intervals beginning in the 1950s to show how listening to Western radios actually changed their worldviews. Soviet archival documents are usually police reports complaining about isolated troublemakers. They were not public opinion surveys. Moreover, communist authorities probably lacked incentive to conduct such studies about their citizens' listening habits. Such polls would give more attention to the abhorred foreign voices, which they hoped would simply go away. As Nestor Rates revealed, the Ceausescu regime never conducted such surveys. It simply set out to bomb the RFA headquarters in Munich in 1981 and murder key RFA anchors, hoping to intimidate future ones. 3 consecutive directors of Radio Free Europe Romanian service mysteriously died of cancer in less than 7 years. Noel Bernard in 1981, Vlad Georgescu in 1988, and Emil Georgescu in 1985. Rates himself received death threats. It is also impossible to speculate that the radio messages always imparted hope to all listeners, given the absence of candid, comprehensive public opinion surveys. Some of the Radio Free Europe imaginative programs praised living standards in the West and explained the latest medicines, for instance, and available for diseases and other such developments. The average listener, with no prospects for emigrating to the West and with no advanced knowledge that the communist empire would eventually collapse between 1989 and 1991, could understandably become depressed, not hopeful, by listening to such broadcasts. The Romanian survey, when it was done, asked for an evaluation of the factors influencing public opinion in the lead up to the overthrow of the Ceausescu regime. This survey was carried out after the Romanian Revolution in 1990. From the respondents, and they were indeed a very small number, they did not reach the figure of 100, 61% thought political change in other Eastern European countries was very important, 53% the Soviet policy, and 33% RFA broadcasts. Typical comments were, I consider RFA had a decisive role in the success of our revolution. Radio Free Europe broadcast focused on details about the massacre in Timișoara. During the time I'd listened daily in the morning and the evening, after hearing about the genocide in Timișoara, the events started in Timișoara a week earlier than in Bucharest, the population of Bucharest, particularly young people, rose against the regime. 20 years earlier, audience researchers, but their view might have been slightly skewed, determined that 59% of the adult population listened to Radio Free Europe at least once a week, and 23% to Voice of America and BBC. A guy wearing a thick jacket and knit trousers, wearing an antenna on the back ending with a white light, enters a room where a similar character stands with his ear attached to a Russian radio. The latter sees the intruder and, more importantly, observes the light is white, not red. He signals him to keep quiet and continues listening to Radio Free Europe. This is a scene from Black the Fall, the first Romanian 100% video game that has already gained international notoriety. The game launched in July 2017, this year, and translates into virtual format the memory of communist times. Răzvan Dumitrache, one of the game's developers, explains, there was a lot of listening to Radio Free Europe. Myself and all my classmates listened. And during school breaks, we talk about what programs we had listened to. We spoke mostly between ourselves. But at some point, the primary school teacher heard us and told us not to mention such a thing again. I did not understand why. Răzvan could not have been more than 11 years old at the time of the incident. So, what could have Răzvan had listened to, and what was so sensitive about this kind of broadcasts? The workers' protest in Brașov, assessment and aftermath. Despite the blackout maintained by the Romanian authorities, accounts of the Brașov workers' demonstration of November 15, 1987 have reached the Western media, from Romania and foreign eyewitnesses and from Western diplomats in Romania. While differing over some details, almost all of the accounts agree on the essentials. Protesting fresh wage cuts and chronic food shortages, several thousand workers from the Red Flag truck plant, instead of going to vote in the local elections taking place nationwide that day, march out at about 9 a.m., heading for the party and administrative headquarters downtown. During the 1-hour march, they sang a Romanian hymn from the Revolution of 1848 and cried, "We want bread and down with dictatorship." They were joined by workers from other Brașov factories where work stoppages had taken place in some sections. Along their way to the central square, and once there, the workers were joined by thousands of their townspeople. Estimates on the size of the crowd vary from 5,000 to 20,000, perhaps reflecting its growth as the events unfolded. Some eyewitnesses even reported that workers were handing out leaflets. Some demonstrators forced their way inside the party headquarters, where they tore apart or threw out of the window furniture, telephones, files. In the square below, this debris was ignited, along with the party banners, placards, and the leader's portrait torn down from the walls of the buildings. Some smaller fires were also started inside the party headquarters. There, the workers discovered ample food supplies, including items like cheese or oranges, chocolate, and even chocolate that have for years been very difficult for all the citizens to obtain. They were stocked up for the party bureaucrats. This only added to the demonstrators' indignation, so that these supplies too were ransacked and thrown into the square. According to the reports, the Brașov first secretary and mayor, Dumitru Calancea, was beaten and rushed to the hospital. Reports of 2 fatalities among the militia have not yet been confirmed. There is no indication of plunder or damage to non-party property at any point. The forces of order, after some apparent hesitation, moved in before dusk. Both militia and army troops with armored personnel carriers were used to clear the downtown area. No clashes were reported. A brief video film shown on November 23rd in the evening newscast of Italian television was the first visual document of the event available in the West. According to those who saw it, the film, shot mostly on the run in downtown Brașov by a Western traveler, showed a large public building damaged by fire and emitting smoke, a street bonfire and several small fires of party flags, propaganda posters, and clearly recognizable official portraits, and a large crowd of demonstrators being pursued by armored vehicles. During this phase, one group of the workers was seen holding aloft and defiantly waving a national flag, and knots of men were seen stopping from flight to throw stones at their pursuers. The photographs published in the left-wing Paris daily Libération showed cleanup operations at dusk on a street strewn with broken glass and debris. Uniformed personnel and armor were again in evidence. The aftermath of the revolt, this is an excerpt from a report presented by Vladimir Sokol on broadcasters on Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty Romanian service on December 4, 1987. So this is the kind of information that Răzvan and his parents and his colleagues could have accessed. The aftermath of the Brașov revolt saw 61 people trialed and sentenced to short-term prison and deportation. A public trial resembling the Stalinist era, with co-workers raising up and asking for the death penalty, was staged. Nevertheless, due to media exposure, the capital punishment was not used, and the accused were found guilty mostly of vandalism. It should also be noted that on November 22nd, only a few days after the revolt, students from the forestry department of the agricultural faculty staged a protest asking for the release of those who were arrested. They were quickly expelled. News about the revolts in Brașov that took place on November 15, 1987 reached Romania through Radio Free Europe, who also received the information from different sources, amongst which was Tanjug, the Serbian, at the time Yugoslavian state news agency. Word that up to 10,000 people, workers, women and children, took to the streets of Brașov and stormed the headquarters of the regional party organization, burning the portraits of Ceausescu and his wife, spread to the entire Central European region. The Western German press declared that even the Romanian polenta had finally exploded. The French media gave ample coverage to the events, and the support demonstration took place in Paris. In fact, Western, American, Yugoslav and Hungarian press all dedicated ample coverage to the event. Days later, speaking on behalf of the Polish people and solidarity, Jacek Kuron sent a letter in support of the Romanian workers. Several communist parties from other countries also condemned the regime, while the varieties and number of the voices of dissent increased during the following years. This is what the Belgian Communist Party had to say about the events in Brasov. It was only too predictable that the absence of freedom and democracy, the authoritarian and personalized style of power, the bureaucratic nature of economic management, the lack of participation by the workers in the country's public affairs, none of which can be explained by foreign debts, would sooner or later give rise to discontent, anger, and even popular revolt. Repression will certainly not bring any valid solution. And indeed, this was not the case. And the polenta finally exploded 2 years later in December 1989. Thank you very much for listening, and please comment on my paper, and I'm sorry I won't be able to take your comments live and answer to your questions, but you can always email me, and I'm sure that my colleagues would make note of your questions, and comments as always are always welcomed. Thank you.
Participă 3 personaje colective. Erau ei, starurile de la radio, un fel de staruri fără imagine. Eram noi, ascultătorii. Dar mai era cineva. Cineva care asculta și ar fi vrut să reducă totul la tăcere.